Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this Kendall Hunt webinar, Meaningful Dialogues in the Corrections Classroom, Balancing Perspectives on Accountability, Transformation, and Rehabilitation. So how do you navigate challenging questions on sensitive issues in your corrections classroom? Well, today we're going to answer that question for you so that you feel confident balancing the perspectives of harm reduction, victim-centeredness, and true accountability. Today, our goal really is to just provide you with some strategies that you can start implementing today. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded. You'll receive access to that in the coming days. If you have a question at any time, feel free to throw that in either the chat function or the Q&A function, and we will have a dedicated Q&A time at the end, so be sure to stick around for that. We're going to jump right in, but before we do, I want to introduce our esteemed speaker today. We have with us Dr. Taryn Vanderpil. She's an associate professor of criminal justice sciences at Western Oregon University. She really just brings just a deeply personal and honestly transformative approach to understanding justice systems. She's got over a decade of direct work with people directly impacted by the criminal justice system, and she amplifies the voices of those who are often overlooked. She's got research that kind of focuses on how we can create more effective interventions and legislation that support successful reentry, reduce recidivism, and she's got personal experience as a special education teacher, a foster parent. She's a passionate advocate, and really just committed to addressing the disproportionate challenges faced by vulnerable populations in our justice systems. So, to sum it up, Dr. Vanderpil isn't just an academic, she is a change agent who bridges research, personal experience, and real world impact, presenting at national conferences and publishing work that pushes our understanding of justice and rehabilitation forward. So, without further ado, Taryn, I'd like to hand it over to you. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Megan. I should make sure you always do my introductions. That was generous. Thank you. So as Megan said, I want to welcome you to this webinar, Meaningful Dialogues in the Corrections Classroom, Balancing Perspectives on Accountability, Transformation, and Rehabilitation. So again, my name is Dr. Taryn Vanderpil. I am an Associate Professor of Criminal Justice Sciences at Western Oregon University. My research and teaching focus on corrections, which I'll tell you more about in a moment. But first, I just want to thank you for joining me today to talk about how we can engage students in critical conversations about the difficult topics that are inherent to talking about incarceration and how we respond to harm. These are not discussions that we should shy away from or try to avoid. Rather, it's essential that we take a deep dive into what is complicated or confusing and can be uncomfortable. When we look at research on learning, it is clear that diving into these difficult conversations will lead not only to greater understanding and improved critical thinking skills, but it also leads to far longer retention of the information. Decades of research has shown that learning experiences connected with emotions lead to deeper comprehension for students and are more likely to be stored long term. So in other words, when emotions are attached to something we learn, when we care about it, when we feel it, we remember it. During this webinar, I will share with you the foundation of why I teach what I teach, as well as how I teach it. Then I'll talk about some important points that should be covered on the first day of class and perhaps repeated a few times throughout the term when reminders are needed. Next, I want to dig into tough questions that come up time and again when we start to talk about how we respond to harm in this country. I will go through 3 difficult questions and explain how we can engage students in developing their critical thinking skills around these tough emotional topics. And then finally, we will wrap up with some thoughts on how to continue the conversation with our students and with one another. I'll tell you a little bit more about my background and how I have come to the point of advocating for change in how corrections is taught in this country. Many years ago, I was a high school special education teacher. I was only there for a couple of years, but those 2 years completely changed the path I thought I was on. I worked with students with emotional and behavioral disorders, learning disabilities, oppositional defiant disorder, and other types of labels that are given at the school level for students who stand out in ways most teachers don't enjoy. I saw many of them go in and out of the juvenile justice system, and I couldn't figure out which came first, the disorder or the system. The National Council on Disability published a report that said 85% of incarcerated youth have disabilities. 85%. That's compared to 11 to 12% of a typical school population. Something is clearly going on here, and I wanted to find out more about it. So I went and got my PhD in special education with a focus on juvenile justice, and for a while, my work focused on youth only. Then I got a call one day from a man who explained he was incarcerated at the state's maximum security prison here in Oregon. He said they had a professor who was going to bring in some students for an event, but had to cancel. So would I like to come into prison and bring a group of students with me? I jumped at the chance. What an amazing learning experience for students. That phone call ended up being the beginning of my exposure to the adult punishment system. It was far different from the juvenile system, and it awoke something in me that propelled me to get involved. Throughout this webinar, I've included pictures of myself and lots of incredible folks who have played a major role in this work. They have taught me in ways no book, webinar, or conference ever could. I learned the value of learning from people with lived experience and from multiple perspectives. So it is from the decade of going into prisons, talking with people who have both caused and survived great harm, really listening to victims and survivors, working with people when they are released, and navigating the politics around this unpopular population that I have formed all of my teaching and research. I have taught corrections 19 times so far, updating it a little bit each time. So it's from this point of view that I conduct this webinar today. Everything I'm sharing today is supported in research and not only in my hug-a-thug research results. The way we respond to harm in this country and the outcomes of that are explored across multiple fields of study, which also supports the notion of learning from multiple perspectives and experiences. Much like telling you where I'm coming from and why, students need the same introduction and foundation for being willing to jump into these tough conversations. In addition to making your classroom a safe space to explore difficult topics, which is an important skill that could fill up a whole additional webinar easily, students will need to be prepared to look at punishment in a way that most of them have not done before, and one that will be constantly challenging of what we have all been taught. It is also important to provide a trigger warning right up front and let them know it applies to every class and every reading. This class covers some really tough things, and that might bring up some pain for some of them, and it's important that they take care of themselves throughout the term. Students need to know first that their viewpoints are both valid and valued, and so are that of other people. So far in their lives, like with most of us, many of them have learned from a singular or a limited perspective or voices. If they will open up to learning from multiple perspectives instead, they will get a richer and fuller picture and a much deeper understanding of what they are studying. It is extremely important at this point to assure students that it is not your goal to change their minds, simply to open them. Half of the assignments in my course are used to check their new content knowledge, but the other half are a check-in. of how they are processing this information, because it's tough. I let them know right up front that I do not need them to agree with me. I just want to know what they think and feel about what we've been covering in class and what they've been reading. I'm looking for genuine reflection, which means there are no right or wrong answers. And they like that part. Students can question and push back all they want. That is great. It means they're feeling something and they are thinking critically about these topics that are really difficult to wrestle with. And that's a solid learning experience and genuine engagement with the material. Another thing that helps is to make it personal right from the get-go. It is very difficult to really think about the bad people behind bars if you can't relate to them. It's too easy to maintain this us versus them mentality and out of sight, out of mind approach to corrections. For the sake of this class, that wall must be broken down. So to start this process, I ask students to think about something they are ashamed to have done, or something they would be embarrassed for people in their lives to witness. I tell them to think of that thing, not to share it out loud, but to think of that thing and imagine there was a video of them doing that thing. Now imagine there's a screen they had to wear every day on the front of their shirt or on their forehead that showed them doing that thing. And this showed this video over and over and over again. So over and over again, that means everywhere they go, everyone sees that. When they walk into a room, the video is the first thing people see. When they go for a job interview, on a date, try to make friends, go to church, volunteer, adopt a pet, rent an apartment, buy groceries, anything. It is the first thing people will see about them. Are they okay with that? How might that feel? I can tell you, this is not great for spurring discussion because they are often very silent after imagining what this would be like. So I continue. I pose another scenario for them to consider. What if a student asked for an extension on an assignment that for some reason I later found out to be a lie? So whatever excuse or reason they gave me, I later found out that they were lying to me. That tells me he's a liar. Every time I see him in class, I will think, what a liar. When I grade his work, I will assume he cheated because he is a liar. If there's any group work in class, I will caution the other students to be careful because he is a liar. When other faculty have him in class, I will warn them up front that he's a liar and they can't trust his work or his excuses. When he graduates, I will post on social media that he doesn't deserve it, didn't really earn it. When he tries to date, or even worse, when he gets married, I will warn the potential partners not to trust him and that he lies. Can't believe a word he says. And if someone contacts me for a job reference, I will tell them not to hire this person because he is a liar. He is a liar and cannot be trusted ever by anyone. Does that feel right? Should one label stay with him and haunt him for so long and in so many situations? Should one bad decision label him like that? Why? Or why not? Students will usually explain that because he did this one thing wrong, it doesn't mean that he is a bad person. And it shouldn't, and it doesn't mean that he shouldn't be given a second chance. This one bad decision shouldn't follow him forever. In the scenario about themselves and about the liar, ask students if they believe they are more than the thing they are ashamed of and more than the worst thing they have ever done. Are they more than whatever negative label would be applied to them if everyone knew what they did? And if they are more than the worst thing they've ever done, isn't everyone else as well? This is easier to accept when we're talking about small things. But what about when we talk about big things? Where do we draw the line? Should there even be a line? There are many public examples of people who have committed great harm, who have changed their lives around and done incredible good. They have proven they are more than the murder or the robbery or whatever it is that they did. And they have received public praise and attention for their transformation and their good works. Are they the only ones who have the chance to be considered as more than the worst thing they've ever done? What about someone who has changed but isn't? And there's my research assistant, Piper. Sorry, Piper loves Zoom and she wants to be a part of this webinar, so she might pop back in. So are they the only ones who have the chance to be considered as more? What about someone who has changed but isn't getting the public attention for it? What about somebody who hasn't changed yet? Should we assume that they are bad until they prove they are good? And what does it take to prove that? The notion that everyone is more than the worst thing they have ever done is the beginning of seeing the humanity involved in the criminal legal system and corrections. Rather than bad guys or monsters we don't want to think about or care about, we must see the humans instead. That means recognizing the humans who are incarcerated, as well as the humans who they hurt, and the humans who work in corrections, all of them. I let students know on the first day that the entire class is focused on one overarching question. How can we respond to harm without causing more harm? This is a question I pose over and over again throughout the term. They need to know that no one is advocating for us to turn a blind eye when someone causes harm. We all agree that there must be accountability for harm caused. I want them to keep thinking about what that response to harm could look like if the goal was not to cause additional harm. The additional harm caused by our current system is something we will return to in every class. Students are often surprised when they learn what is really happening in our system of punishment. It is rarely what they assumed, and certainly not what they have seen on TV. In this class, they should get a clearer picture of what is really going on, as well as the outcomes that are occurring as a result of what is going on. After all, this is a giant system with a 70% failure rate that typically leads to an increase in both frequency and the level of violence of criminal offending. And 95% of these folks are going to get out and be our neighbors. So is that something we're okay with? Is that what we want from the system that claims to be keeping us safe and making people pay for what they have done wrong? This often leads to our next big question that will come up multiple times throughout the term. Students, and most people honestly, have a hard time holding space for multiple perspectives on one topic. When we talk about more effective ways to respond to harm, people often think that means we're forgetting the victims, and nothing could be further from the truth. Victims and survivors should be at the center of this work, and public safety should always be the priority. Where we go wrong is believing that our current system is actually helping victims and making the public more safe. We can't be more safe if 95% of folks are going to get out and 70% of them are going to reoffend, and they're going to increase the frequency and the violence of their offending. That's not public safety. That's not what that looks like. Still, the anger and the fear that drive our current responses to harm should never be discounted. Those feelings are very real and very important. And whatever a victim needs to help them heal is the priority. One hiccup here is to be honest about who we are picturing when we talk about victims and who we are picturing when we talk about offenders. The notion that these are two separate, distinct groups is incorrect. This is a false dichotomy that is easier to believe because it makes responses to harm more straightforward. However, Something that is important to recognize and remember is that almost everyone who has committed a crime was previously a victim of a crime. Of course, not every victim will go on to be an offender, but almost every offender was first a victim. There's a lot of overlap between these two supposedly separate groups that our system of punishment is not set up to recognize. Let me give you some examples. Consider a boy who is raised in a violent home where he observes his father be physically abusive to his mother and he is subject to the same abuse himself. We would consider him a victim. Until later in his life, when he treats his own wife and child the same way, then he becomes an offender. How about a woman who's in an abusive relationship? Victim. Who is made to steal for her partner? Offender. How about a gang member whose brother is murdered? Victim. Who then retaliates and takes another life from the rival gang? Offender. Finally, what about a woman who is being trafficked for sex? Victim. Who then kills her trafficker? Offender. She becomes a criminalized survivor, and there is no category for that in our system. Once we're honest about this false dichotomy of victims and offenders, we can better listen to what the victims and survivors have to say. What is it they want from this system that claims to be for them? Consider that the state takes over in the legal system as the victim because someone broke a social contract or a law. Where does that put the actual person who experienced and probably continues to experience the harm? Does it help them? Does it compound their hurt? If we are claiming to prioritize victims, we better actually listen to them first. There's also a consideration of what our current system of punishment is like for those working in it. One example that shows the importance of helping our students look at corrections from multiple perspectives is the death penalty. They have likely done the exercise in high school or other classes where they debated the arguments for and the arguments against capital punishment. But it's unlikely they've ever looked at the effect of the death penalty on those correction staff who are responsible for carrying out the execution. Our current practices create another class of victims we maybe didn't even know about. Students need to learn directly from those who work in corrections to understand what it is like, as well as the potential of this career path. Of the three parts of the criminal justice system, very simply put, cops, courts, corrections, and those who work in corrections, they have quite possibly the greatest potential to impact public safety by trying to help people leave better than when they came in. Building on these two tough questions of how can we respond to harm without causing additional harm, and what about the victims, we need to keep pushing students and ourselves to figure out what it would truly look like to hold someone accountable for the harm they have caused. Is it locking them in cages for decades and never challenging them to face what they have done and to learn and to grow and to change? Is being tough on crime by focusing on punishment only really making us any safer? Or does it create more victims because of the recidivism? Is there something we could do instead to address harm and promote healing? What is often mistaken for being soft on crime, such as focusing on rehabilitation and personal transformation as part of true accountability, is proven to make society safer. So why don't we do that? Why can't we support that? Why might some find it hard to support that? The picture on this slide, the two pictures on this slide are from a powerful journey that I was blessed to witness of a young man who was incarcerated for a series of burglaries and robberies that he used to fund his heroin addiction. He came into prison young, angry, and broken. He was given a 14-year sentence and thrown in a cage to be warehoused. The only intervention he got came from those in a white supremacist prison gang. As a result, he did not face the harm he had caused, and he went on to perpetuate more harm against others inside the prison. It wasn't until many years into his sentence that he decided on his own to face what he had done and commit to change. He sought out his own rehabilitation and directed his own remarkable personal transformation. He chose to dig in until he could fully understand and come to terms with the harm he had caused. Sitting with what you have done, what you are ashamed of, and facing how you have hurt people is incredibly difficult. It is painful, far more painful than being warehoused and not having to think about your bad decisions. Taking an honest look at the harm you have caused is vulnerable and terrifying and has to be done in a place that is scary and unsafe and unsupportive of this type of reflection and growth. How might this type of deep transformative work fit into holding someone accountable? Again, keep coming back to the question, what does it truly look like to hold someone accountable for the harm they have caused? I'm happy to say the man in these pictures went through his own remarkable transformation and brought others along with him. He changed despite prison, not because of it. The picture of us on the left is from when he was in prison. On the right is from the day he was released. He is now out and is continuing to advocate for healing, transformation, and genuine accountability. He chose to become a credible messenger and a change maker, and he is far more than the worst thing he has ever done. We all are. And the notion of having him come out still addicted to heroin, or still in a white supremacist gang, or still the troubled man that he was, that's going to lead to more harm in the community versus him going through this transformation, coming out this incredible person who's working to make the community more safe and to spread healing. There are a lot of great resources that can help create a safe space and prepare students for these difficult conversations. There are free videos, podcasts, webinars, and more. I have provided links to many of these in the instructor materials that come with my book, Corrections 360, a look at corrections from all angles. In this book, I made it a priority to include multiple perspectives, from those with lived experience in prison, both currently and formerly, from family members of those incarcerated, from victims and survivors of crime, particularly violent crime, from people who work in the field, everything from probation to a jail commander. And also, I prioritize diversity among all these contributions in terms of gender identity, race and ethnicity, the crime of conviction, their current role, etc. So a little different than a typical textbook, students will gain a well-rounded understanding of corrections. In addition to including personal stories from each of these perspectives, I made sure anyone can teach this class and do it well, even if they've never been into a prison. With the book comes a long list of resources for instructors. So there are sample syllabi for online classes or for on-campus classes for 10-week terms or 15-week semesters. There are lesson plans, again, for online or on campus, with multiple options for each chapter. And there are additional activities to use in class as well. There are case studies to dig deeper into some of the topics. There are chapter outlines, lecture notes, PowerPoints, and there's a test bank for each chapter. Then for students, they benefit from an app, a study app that helps with preparing them for exams or just, practicing and remembering the material. Also at our university, it's a priority to have low-priced textbooks. So this book is also priced lower than other ones I've seen on the market. So it's $45 for the ebook, which at our university, that's the cutoff. That's the price that we want. And it's $65 if they want a printed copy. So another thing I put in there that's just for students is a box at the end of each chapter called Making Change. Students had told me they wanted to learn how to make a difference in specific areas that concern them. They said the classes were the classes were depressing because we talked about all these things that were wrong, and they wanted to know what to do about it. So because of them, I added that book about making change. So the end of each chapter includes a way to get involved if it's an area that is important to them personally. I also encourage you to dig in and continue this critical conversation with colleagues, students, those in your social circle, your professional network, and with me. Please reach out if you have any questions or would like to bounce around ideas, whatever it is. If it helps students' understanding of corrections and the humans in the system, I'm more than happy to engage. So that's all for me now in terms of my presentation. And I just want to thank you again for joining me in this webinar.
Wow, thank you so much, Taryn. That was really great. Um, and it was really cool to just kind of get that perspective of not only just kind of your teaching philosophy in general, but kind of like how you start a class, how you kick things on, the groundwork that you lay before you start having these challenging conversations. So if anyone has a question, feel free to throw it into the Q&A or the chat function at this time, but I'm actually gonna kick it off here. I'm curious, what, if any, sort of feedback have you experienced from students in your class? Because as you alluded to, I'm sure these conversations can get pretty gritty pretty quick.
They are, and that's another important reason to establish that safe space right up front and set up an environment where it's okay to disagree with one another, but it needs to happen in a way that's kind and respectful, and know that we're all trying to work through this really, really tough material. And we don't need to all agree with one another. I can say, having taught the class now 19 times, um, let's just say that's 200 students, which is conservative, but out of 200 students, I can only think of one that was really, really bothered by this. And he was so great about it though, because he kept having those critical conversations the whole term. And then at the end of the term, when I asked for his final feedback, um, he just really did not enjoy trying to look at corrections from this angle, which I fully respect. But he's the only one who hasn't been able to, out of say 200 or so students, the only one who hasn't been able to really kind of shift that understanding, not necessarily change their opinion, but get to the point where they're going to pause and critically think through what we are discussing, and critically think through the news stories they hear, or when they meet somebody who has a criminal record, or any of these things that are especially challenging. One of the things I enjoy is when I ask students in the first class what accountability looks like to them, and then I ask them again in the last class. And one of the things I really like is when they say, I came into this class thinking, like, I knew, first of all, I thought this class was going to be boring. Class about prison, cool. It's a great class. It's very interesting. So to have them go from, I thought I knew, to now I have no idea. That's perfect, because that means they're thinking critically, and it's okay to not know the answers, especially at that point. So I love that part.
Yeah, wow. And not that it's, about numbers necessarily, but like I think 1 out of 200, that's a pretty darn good batting average. Um, and like, and it's so promising that like, so many students are willing to, come to the table and agree to disagree and have like productive dialogue. So, that's really encouraging. Are there any other classes that you teach where these sorts of issues tend to come up, or, challenging conversation, but potential headbutting, or, it sounds like you're pretty good at managing that, but are there any other classes you teach?
Yes, I actually teach a class on victimology, which kind of
Mm.
surprises some people because, again, it's easier to think that I've forgotten the victims, I guess. So we talk about this stuff in the victimology class. I also teach a class on gangs. And with gangs, it's important to look at, go back and look at why did this kid at 9 years old decide to get jumped into a gang and beaten up so that he could have a sense of family. And looking at that differently, and also looking at the harm he caused when he was in there. So these are tough. These are all really tough topics, and there's a lot of hurt involved.
Yeah, excellent. Um, yeah, my goodness. Well, it sounds like you kind of tackle this issue from a whole range of perspectives, which I didn't mean to make a pun there because that's like the title of your book. But can you can you explain about your book just a little bit more? Not to put you on the spot or anything, but when you were like, okay, I there's something on the market that's lacking enough that I feel the need to sit down and pen hundreds of pages. Kind of what was going through your head? What were you looking to accomplish?
I had used other textbooks, and just to be clear, the other textbooks are good. The difference is that most of them are written by people who have worked in the field, and it comes from that one perspective, which is a very valuable perspective. There are others who come from folks who have researched this area, and again, that's a very valuable perspective. What I wanted to do was put all those together, put together the perspectives of the people who work in the field, the people who have researched the field, but also the people who have lived it. Because there is nothing like learning from somebody who has spent 30 years in prison and who can tell you what the food is like, what the smells are like, what the sound is like, what it's like to work through what they've done and what that means to them. And also, most books, well, I couldn't find any that included the perspective of the victims. What are we doing? I they have to be the center of this. So when I teach the class, I want to make sure that the students read the book. I think we always do that when we select a book for a class. We want the students to actually read it. So one of the ways that I do that, I said half of my assignments check content knowledge and half of them are a check-in on how they're doing. The way that breaks down over the term is each time there's a chapter assigned as their reading assignment, we do a reading accountability quiz, just a short low stakes kind of quiz, and that checks the content. And I tell them they can use notes, but they can't use the textbook. So what that has them do is read the textbook and take notes on what they're learning, and they're usually handwritten notes, which tells me they're not just using AI to summarize the chapter. So they use those notes on that test. It's not an anxiety thing. It's just reading accountability, because I tell them right up front, I know if I don't hold you accountable, you're not going to do the reading. I was a student. I didn't do it. And then after that, I have them online to answer a lecture response question. And I tell them, I'm not going to just teach you what's in the textbook. You're adults, you can read the book. So I want them to read, and then I'm going to pick one topic from that chapter, and we're going to dig in deep. And then I want to hear how they're processing that. How did they process that really tough stuff that we talked about in class, in addition to what they read? And in this manner, I feel like I can make sure they're taking in the reading material as much as, I can control that, and they're taking in the lecture. And that I've enjoyed that practice, and students seem to enjoy that as well. That's gone really well.
Hmm. Well, and I think too, it just, it mirrors your whole philosophy, which is critical thinking. Whatever it is that your beliefs are, like, let's think critically through stuff, but then having that reinforced from a pedagogical standpoint, I think is also really helpful because it gets the dust off, it gets those gears working in the way that you want them to go. Well, let's see. Do we have any other questions today? It's looking like we don't. Karen, are there any final things that you would like to say to everyone?
I would just welcome folks to reach out if there's anything that they want to bounce around. Like I said, I'm really happy to talk with folks about this anytime. I think it's so important that our students learn to think critically about these topics. And this is a tough one. It's hard to do this. So I'm happy to continue the conversation. My contact info is up on the screen there. If anybody wants to reach out, please do.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much for your time today. We've really enjoyed just hearing from you and your teaching perspective and how to have these tough conversations. And thank you to our listeners who I'm assuming you also teach very similar classes. Thank you for doing the work that you do. And so this concludes today's webinar. In the coming days, we'll be getting in touch with you to provide you the link in case there were any parts that you missed, or if you are listening to this after the fact, we'll get that to you as well. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful day.